Okay, in this video, I'm going to go over Jefferson and his comments about debt and who the debt belongs to. So this is the dead, which means any dead person, fictions of law, creditors, etc. He says that they have no right to the earth, and they have no right to the earth because they are dead, and the dead have no right to the earth. And he explains. In a letter written by Jefferson to Madison in 1789, Jefferson repeatedly states to Madison, and he's explaining to him, that the dead have no right to the earth. Okay, so what does he mean by this? First, we have people who are natural people and own property and then die. Once they are dead, they are called a decedent. Jefferson is mainly speaking of this kind of death, the death of a person who owes a debt. If a person owes a debt and dies, do the banks then own the property? Jefferson says no. Jefferson says no because then the earth would belong to the dead. So second, you have dead entities which are legal fictions. They're like banks, your legal person, or what some people refer to as your government name, the one on the birth certificate, your legal name. So he says the dead being the debtor as well as the dead also includes the bank or creditor when the creditor is not a natural person. As a bank is an entity not living, not having life, not having senses, which is important in law. It has no will of its own, nor does it have senses, therefore it is not human and has no life. It is therefore dead. The dead as a debtor cannot pass his debt to his children because it seems that Jefferson is looking at it as if the debt is attached to the person. The person once dead, the debt dies with him. Debt cannot be passed from one generation to the next, otherwise the debt accumulates and the generations are bound, which allows one generation to pay for the debts of the dead. This means the earth belongs to the dead since the dead are in perpetual debt, which places the earth in perpetual debt to those who have died, including the creditors. Eventually, creditors die and the debt is still owed. So who is it owed to? The earth? Then the earth belongs to the dead. Here's an example. It's a quote. This is from Jefferson. To render this conclusion palpable by example, suppose that Louis XIV and XV had contracted debts in the name of the French nation to the amount of 10,000 milliards of livres, and that the whole had been contracted in Genoa. The interest of this sum would be 500 milliards, which is said to be the whole rent roll or net proceeds of the territory of France. End quote. Jefferson continues to say that the next generation of men who inherit the earth tied to the creditors of their fathers. If they are, then they have no right to the soil, meaning that once they're born, they have no right to the soil. They're without land. They are bound to the dead. They are bound to pay for what the dead accumulated. They are without rights, even though born on the land. So Jefferson states, no, this cannot be. The next generation has no responsibility for the previous debts and cannot be bound to the creditors or the debt, but still have a right to the soil because they were born on it. So he's really making a distinguishment between debt and credit, or debt and the dead, and the next generation and the living. So credit or debt, it all belongs to the dead or to a fiction, whereas humans being born are real, and the earth is real and all in nature, and they belong to each other. So you can't really mix them from generation to generation to generation. So when one generation passes, basically all their BS goes with them, and the next generation is renewed. So like you have the renewal in spring, everything grows back. So it dies and then it grows back anew, right? It's not the same flower, it's a new flower, or the same blade of grass, it's a new blade of grass. It's not the same human being, it's a new human being with life. Okay, so they inherit the earth. Jefferson continues his quote. Must the present generation of men have retired from the territory in which nature produced them and ceded it to the Genoese creditors? No. They have the same rights over the soil on which they were produced as the preceding generations had. They derive these rights not from their predecessors, but from nature. They then and their soil are by nature clear of the debts of their predecessors. End quote. So I believe he's saying this because many people say that your home loan is not for the land, but for what's built on it. It's for the house or 6 inches of soil and up. I've heard that in many different groups. So this reason may be why they're saying that when you go and you get a home loan, it's not for the actual land, it's for what's sitting on the land. Whether that's true or not, I don't really know. Okay, so Jefferson's saying, and many have said, and must in fact be true, that nature and the laws of nature are the first laws. They are above all other laws. They are the foundation of all systems of governments, tribes, societies, communities. And the laws of nature are the supreme laws over all other laws. Therefore, the generations born on the lands have the first right to the lands. The creditors have no right to the land or the next generation of people who did not contract debts with the creditors. Therefore, the laws not in harmony with nature are pretty much meaningless when the generation dies. The contracts and debts and constitution and laws die with them. So if your father contracts a debt and agrees to pay interest for a number of years, he's the only responsible person for the debt and the repayment of debt. Banks cannot confiscate lands of their children for their father's debt because the children are living and the creditors are dead entities, fictions, artificial beings, persons in law but not in nature. If a creditor or bank could confiscate lands from the next generation, the earth would belong to the dead and not the living, and we should understand that this cannot be. The earth cannot belong to the dead. It can only belong to the living. So Jefferson continues, quote, again, suppose Louis XV and his contemporary generation had said to the moneylenders of Genoa, give us money that we may eat, drink, and be merry in our day, and on condition you will demand no interest till the end of 19 years. You shall then forever after receive an annual interest of 12 5/8%. The money is lent on these conditions, is divided among the living, eaten, drank, and squandered. Would the present generation be obliged to apply the produce of the earth and their labor to replace their dissipations? Jefferson says, no, not at all. End quote. So he's saying that if the fathers acquired debt and squandered the money and used it up and did not produce anything with the money lent to them, the next generation has to pay off the transgressions of the previous generation. Thomas Jefferson says this is not how it's done. The living do not pay for the dead. If they did, they would labor the land to grow and produce to pay the debts of the dead. This means that the earth and all its produce is now going to pay the debts of the dead people, which means the earth belongs to the dead because the living have to use the earth to pay the debts of the dead. So creditors have no right to the earth. They make contracts to their own detriment. They should be cautious who they contract with and how much money they lend and the age of the person they choose to lend the money to, because they can only collect interest for as long as the person is living and they can collect nothing else because the earth cannot belong to the dead. It can only belong to the living. This also makes it less attractive for banks to give credit to those who are likely to squander money, and since it is more difficult for a debtor to acquire the credit, it makes the credit something that is better used and more controlled. So, in other words, banks have no incentive to lend to irresponsible people who squander money if they cannot collect from the future generation. They cannot own the future or the future of what the land produces. So they're less likely to lend, which makes it less likely for generations to get deep in debt to pay back so much money, more than eventually it would be more than the earth can even produce. So at some point in time it has to end, and Jefferson's point is that it ends at the end of 19 years, which historically a generation, previously I'd read it was 20 years, because the average age that a person grows up and then starts having children is about 20, like between 15 and 25. 20, Jefferson says 19. When everyone can get credit, and as much credit as they want to buy whatever they want, the money loses its value. We enter a system of greed and corruption, which we have. Wealth becomes a game among men, which it has, and the poor and middle class suffer. They do. If you want to know more about how this works, read Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds by Charles Mackay, written in 1852, a work recommended by Ron Paul. Okay, in reading this book, I started thinking of birth certificates, where we stated on them that we are a legal, meaning dead, name. Legal things are dead things. We're given legal names, and it is a legal document, but also being natural persons with a will, senses, and life. We are the living, and having been born on the land, we are not responsible for the debts of the past generations, and the land belongs to us and our natural person, because the land can only belong to the living, and the living own the earth. This is in accordance with the natural law. Again, natural law being the supreme law that governs all men in all their natural states. But governments like to create dead things. And some governments could be considered dead, even though they may or may not be directly created by men. So therefore, banks, creditors, governments, etc., with or without so-called legal title, are dead entities without will, senses, life, cannot own anything, cannot take anything. They are not born. They therefore cannot take anything or own the earth. And they can't own the future produce of the earth. The interest on debt must be paid by the generation that accumulates the debt, and then the generation is not bound to the debt, and the land still belongs to them because they are the living. Okay, so Jefferson quotes, "I suppose that the received opinion that the public debts of one generation devolve on the next has been suggested by our seeing habitually in private life that he who succeeds to the lands, so inherits, our children who inherit the land, is required to pay the debts of his ancestor or testator, without considering that this requisition is municipal only." So this historical law is just a municipal law. He says it's not moral, flowing from the will of society, which has found it convenient to appropriate lands become vacant by the death of their occupant on the condition of a payment of his debts. But that between society and society, or generation and generation, there is no municipal obligation, no umpire, but the law of nature. We seem not to have perceived that by the law of nature. One generation is to another as one independent nation to another. Yet we record our deeds and titles as legal entities which are dead. In the same way Jefferson talks about debt not being perpetual and not being from one generation to the next, he also talks about constitutions and laws not being binding from one generation to the next. He says that the earth always belongs to the living. It cannot belong to the dead. Therefore, those who have passed are the dead, and the ways into which they lived and their creations passed with them. The new generation, the living, must have their own constitutions and laws, because the earth must always belong to the living. Jefferson says, quote, "It may be proved that no society can make a perpetual constitution or even a perpetual law. The earth belongs always to the living generation," end quote. He states that every constitution then and every law naturally expires at the end of 19 years. If it be enforced longer, quote, "it is an act of force and not of right." Jefferson continues to say that it may be said that the succeeding generation exercising in fact the power of repeal, this leaves them as free as if the Constitution or law had been expressly, that means in writing, limited to 19 years only. So what I've noticed about the founders is that they didn't write the foundations of law in the Constitution. They assumed that you would know that. And I've read in other places that the reason they did that was they thought it was redundant and elementary and made them sound stupid to write things that they felt like people already knew was common sense. So why would you write common sense in the Constitution and insult people's intelligence? So he was saying that naturally, of course, the Constitution would expire, or society's constitutions or previous generations' constitutions or their laws, even their law customs, would expire after 19 years, because every new generation is the living generation, and they have a right to the earth. They have a right to their own ideas. They have a right to their own laws. They have a right to create their own customs. They have the right to acquire new debt, to build new things, to create new things, and that their children shouldn't be responsible for those debts. So it's up to the banks and the creditors, the lenders, to figure out how long the lifespan is and how much they want to lend. And they do that because by law, they shouldn't normally be allowed to take people's property. So if they can take people's property, there's an incentive to overextend credit, because then they can just go and take the property. They know you're not going to live this long. They know that they can use government to take the property even from the occupants that are on it. Remember, possession is 9/10 of the law. So banks have an interest in giving more money than they know you can pay back, which creates a really bad situation. And it's the situation that we're in now. You know, they're saying you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. I wouldn't be happy, okay? I want something to be able to pass to my offspring. Okay, so moving along, Jefferson also states, remember, Jefferson's in Paris, and this was in 1789, so he's speaking from Europe. So he says in this quote, this side of the globe, he's speaking from Europe. He's in France, Paris, France. Okay, and this is on contracting debts. Quote, it will exclude at the threshold of our new government the contagious and ruinous errors of this quarter of the globe, which have armed despots with means not sanctioned by nature for binding in chains their fellow men. So what he's saying is the same thing that we're experiencing now in America today, that the banks have bound us to debt intentionally so that they can take the lands and they can bind the generation that didn't acquire the debt. Okay? So, and Jefferson's whole purpose in this is saying that's your fault. If you've overextended credit, that's your fault. You can't take anything because the banks and the creditors, unless it's just one man contracting with another man, they have no right because they're dead. And if dead people have rights, then the earth belongs to the dead. And he says that it can't be that way. In nature, the earth can only belong to the living. So the idea was not to bind the fellow men and not to bind the future generations with debt. Previously, Jefferson stated that reimbursement is a question of generosity and not of right. So we see that there is, in fact, the ideas of natural law embedded in the ideas of the founders, that the ideas of federalism are the ideas of the founders, and the Executive Order 13132 acknowledges that the government is based on the ideas of federalism established by the founders, being the idea of natural law. Natural law states, according to Jefferson, that the land belongs to the generation in possession of it. That if a government is a legal entity, it cannot possess land because it is a dead thing. Therefore, the only way the government can be in possession of land is to make itself in accordance with natural law. However, the Constitution and the laws expire after 19 years. Jefferson acknowledged that there is no need to repeal a constitution or the law, since after 19 years it expires, even though it's not expressly written in the Constitution. Jefferson, however, does not state how a majority of people would repeal a law. Historically, the repeal is done by writing. The law is repealed and passing the writing into the record. Okay, so here I wrote in my paper that Jefferson doesn't expressly write how a law is repealed. He doesn't use repeal in the Declaration of Independence, but he does say that governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizations, its powers in such form as to themselves shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness, and on and on. And you know what the Declaration of Independence says. And I'd also like to point out that he did sign the Declaration of Independence. However, he did not sign the Articles of Confederation or the Constitution. Okay. So that's this video, and there's a lot of things to think about when you're thinking about what I've said in this video and what Jefferson wrote and what his ideas were in the natural law and how things are ran with the banks currently and the federal government, and how they've gone outside the Constitution. They don't even follow it anymore. For example, we don't have natural money. Natural money is gold and silver. It comes from the earth. It's real, it's tangible, it comes from nature, just like humans do. We live off the earth. We require the earth to live. If we live off the earth and in outer space or whatever, you still require things from the earth. Food, water, meat, vegetable. Okay, so we require the earth to live. The Constitution acknowledges gold and silver as legal tender, and the reason why is because natural people use natural currency, natural money, to acquire natural things. You can use the debt money, the Federal Reserve notes, to acquire a home built by people, not, you know, an adobe hut or a teepee or anything. And so you're acquiring something that's built by, I guess, sort of dead people because they're working as a corporation. Corporations are not true, meaning they're not in nature. You don't just go out in nature and find a corporation. People, natural people, create corporations. Corporations were intended to be something that was temporary, and they would come together for a specific purpose and then end. But we don't see that these days. We see corporations going on and on and on and living into perpetuity, just like trust. And then they tell you have to register your business, register your trust with the federal government, which doesn't follow a natural law anymore. It follows it follows all these other titles that aren't even made laws. They have no positive law citation. There's no proof of them being made law, and they're not heard in the federal courts or courts of the United States. They're heard in like some dead court or court administered by dead fictions, by legal fictions, by men acting outside of their oath and outside of the law. So I think that's why also they have to take an oath, because the oath is swearing to God, right? Or an affirmation. You're swearing naturally. You're taking a moral stance that you're going to be a loyal person to the people by following the Constitution. So when you go into these courts these days, the judges don't even have oaths. So what kind of judge are they? And in order to, like say Title 12 banks and banking, it's a title, but it's never been passed into law. So if the law has to be in conjunction with or in harmony with the Constitution, and it's not a law and it's not in harmony with the Constitution, and you're going into a corporate court that looks like a federal court, and there's a judge sitting there that doesn't have an oath or affirmation to be a moral and loyal person and follow the laws of the Constitution, then it's just a contract, and it's a contract with a dead entity, meaning like a bank, or like the IRS. The IRS is acting outside of the Constitution. It's acting outside of the natural law. It issues checks. It requires you to have direct deposit. It takes directly your labor, which is you're from the earth. Your direct labor is from the earth. It's taking living things with real value, real natural value, and converting it into something to be used by the dead. The IRS is a dead entity. Banks are dead entities. They're not real. They're fictions. They're artificial. Okay, so they're real, but they're not true. True is nature. Real is in between nature and the dead, or the living and the dead, and then you just have the dead. So you have true, which is absolute nature. Real, meaning it is really there, like a vehicle is real, but then a vehicle is also dead because it's artificial. It didn't come directly from the earth. Things that come directly from the earth are true. So there's a lot to think about in here, and I hope that when you hear this video, you will think about what's living and what's dead, and what Jefferson has to say about the living and the dead, and that the dead have no authority or control over the living. They can't bind the future. They can't live off the future produce of the earth. They can only take from what it contracted with, and once that dies, the contract is over. It ends. It's I don't know if you would say void or voidable. Void, I guess. And even though today we have these municipal laws that say that you can force the future to pay for the past, he's saying that those are not true laws, and that it's vastly misunderstood, because the future generations are the living, and society should be making its own laws as to how to pay the debts of the dead. Okay, and again, possession's 9/10 of the law. So if your father dies and you inherit the land, and there's debt attached to the land, the debt is supposed to die with the dead person. Okay, so the living always inherits a clean slate. Okay, so hopefully you'll think about the video, and you'll be able to understand this weird, messed up system that we're in right now, and how it really has no authority, it has no power, it has no jurisdiction. Any constitution, any law, that's all old stuff. After 19 years, it should expire, and we should be allowed to make laws for ourselves, and that way we can always do what's right for us, because we are the living, we are not the dead.